So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to lesson 5 of the world of Kabbalah. Tonight, we're going to try and make sense, actually. We're going to climb a little higher on our chart that's behind me, over my right shoulder. But we're going to really try and make sense, in a sense, of some gaps in what we've talked about till now, okay? In lesson 1, we talked about Biyah, right? The 3 worlds of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. The acronym is Biyah. And we referred to those, one of our key terms was Yeshus or Mitzios, which means existence. And those are worlds that are creations and at varying degrees of existence and independent feeling and so on, as we discussed there. When we climbed a little higher than that, we went to the world of Atzilus, also a world, but it's the world of Atzilus. And we said that the world of Atzilus is fundamentally different than the worlds of Biyah, in that Biyah are existence, creation, and Atzilus is godliness. We introduced in lesson 2 the term Elikus, right? Elokut, which means godliness. It's not God himself. It's also not existence. It's godliness. So we referred to that when we discussed Atzilus, and then we kept climbing a little bit higher. But there are 2 gaps in what we've been talking about, because we also climbed a little higher. We went to Or Ein Sof, to the infinite light. We talked about Sovev Kalam and Mamala Kalam, and God, as he's transcendent, as he is immanent, fills the spaces and transcends them. But a question still remains, which is, how do you get from infinite to finite? And how also do you get from non-existence to existence? What's the transition from infinite? How do you transition from infinite to finite? And how do you transition from from nothingness or just God into otherness? Where is that? How does that transition take place? So that's the missing link that we're going to address tonight. And so if you look in your charts that you have with your student books, and if you can make out the chart behind me, we're actually going to be talking about that gray area towards the top of the chart, as well as the area between Atzilus and Biyah, which we glossed over, what's called the Parsa. Okay, so, but tonight we're going to talk about tzimtzum. The answer, the one term that will explain it all, make sense of it all, is the word tzimtzum. The word tzimtzum, which means contraction. And we're going to start. And obviously, we'll see how this idea of tzimtzum, which is a concept introduced by Rabbi Isaac Luria, by the Ari, and we're going to read the source text of this teaching. We're going to see, though, obviously, as we move through tonight's class, how this idea is also very relevant in our everyday life. So let's buckle up and let's get started here with text 1. Okay, let's take a look at this text. Text 1, page 143. Right, this is from Rabbi Chaim Vital in the Eitz Chaim. Rabbi Chaim Vital, as we've been discussing, the great writer of the teachings of the Ari, his authorized writer, and he says like this: before Atzilut was emanated, by the way, note the word emanation, right? We know the difference between emanate and create, right? We've discussed that as well. So before Atzilut was emanated, and before the creations were created, a simple divine light filled all of reality. It had no aspect of beginning or end. It is called Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. Right? So we're familiar with these terms already. Atzilut, emanation, and Atzilut being emanation, the word Atzilut itself is translated as emanation, right? Creation, that's already Biyah, that's already existence. And then we have this light, the Or Ein Sof, we're familiar with that, the infinite divine light. When it arose in his will to create the worlds and to emanate Atzilus, he contracted his infinite light and an empty space emerged. He then projected downward a single straight line from his circular light, devolving into this empty space. Within this empty space, he emanated, created, fashioned, and made all worlds. Right? Let's just note again at the end here. Within this empty space, he emanated, right? That would be a reference to Atzilus, right? Created, Bria, fashioned, Yitzira, and made Asiya, right? So you can see already how your Kabbalistic minds are already being sharpened. You can start reading, the deeper meaning into some of these texts. At any rate, what we're saying here, what is this text saying? That all there was the infinite light. The infinite light had to be contracted, and there was an empty space. And then he says that a single straight line emerges downward, projects downward from the circular light. Right. So we've got circles, we've got lines, we've got an empty space, contraction. What are we talking about here? What's going on? So the first thing is, obviously we know, we've made this disclaimer a number of times throughout all these classes in this course, we don't take anything in Kabbalah literally, right? We can't understand everything literally, right? We have to understand it allegorically. So obviously we're not talking about that the infinite light is a circle. We're not talking about this idea of the kav, which is the straight line, as an actual literal straight line, but you're using these terms deliberately. So let's try and make sense of them, right? So at first there's the divine infinity, the or Ein Sof, that's infinity, right? Infinity would seemingly preclude the possibility for finiteness, for finitude, right? Although you can make the argument, obviously, that for something to be truly infinite would mean that it also has to have the capacity to be finite, because if it doesn't have that capacity, well, then it has a limitation. And so it's limited in that it can't be finite. So something could be limited to infinity, which sounds like an oxymoron, but in a sense, that's the limitation of infinity, is that it's infinite, it's not finite, right? So we'll come back to this point soon. But the point is, you have God's infinite light, and that's referred to as a circle. Right, from the circle where he contracts himself from that circle. He removes himself, as it were, seemingly. That's what we're saying here. He removes himself, right? He contracts himself from this circle and creates a void, an empty space. Why the circle? Again, because the circle has no beginning and no end. So the circle represents this idea of infinity. And then you have a straight line that's projected. What's the straight line? A straight line. A line is something that is defined. A line has a beginning and has an end. That's what makes it a line. Right, so a line has a beginning, and so a line represents finite, a finite revelation, finite reality. And so what happens is you have this major event that takes place where you have only the infinite divine light, and that really precludes any possibility for any kind of definition of anything. It's purely abstract, right, and it's infinite. There's no definition, there's no boundaries. The idea of the 10 attributes that we were talking about, or even the vessels and the lights that we talked about last week, of the lights of Tohu, and all of that is not possible in a space of total infinity. In order for that to start taking place, what has to happen is there has to be this tzimtzum, this contraction. Okay, now that's the original contraction referred to as tzimtzum harishan, the first contraction, the first limitation. That brings us to our key terms 1 and 2 today on page 144, right? The first term is tzimtzum harishan, that first contraction. And the second term, which is kav, or that straight line that's we referenced in text 1, we read about that kav, that line that emanates of finite godliness that emerges from that void, that empty space, the makam panoi, that was created by this contraction. Okay, so so now we have sort of a sense, we have an idea of how we got from infinite to finite, from undefined to definition. Okay, but still, how do we explain this? And why is it the contraction? How do we understand this idea that a contraction then leads to this, to that possibility? But before we get to that, we have to first know also, when we say contraction, what do we mean? So here, this teaching of the Arizal, right, which is the first place, I mean, there are echoes of it in prior works, but really the first one to introduce this concept of tzimtzum is the Arizal. But differing opinions developed and emerged as to trying to make sense of what this contraction that he was talking about is all about. What does it mean? We're going to present tonight the Chabad perspective on it, and which is not even, the other sources in Kabbalah. We're going to read one in a moment that explain it in the same way. But this is the position that Chabad has taken, and to the point of really sort of rejecting the other possibility, right? And what are these two possibilities? Well, the two possibilities are that the contraction is a literal contraction. And again, when we say literal, we mean it the way our kids mean it today, which is figuratively, right? When we say literally, we mean figuratively today, right? So when we say literal contraction, what do we mean by the tzimtzum being literal? We mean that when the Arizal says that God removes himself from that space, from that circle, and creates an empty space, it means an actual void, a place devoid of godliness. How is that possible? Because God could do whatever he wants. So that's what he does. He creates an empty space where there is no godliness. And then into that space, he projects this vivifying light that then starts this process of creation. So obviously it comes from the divine energy that creates it, but it was a energy that was sort of God first had to create like a blank canvas, an empty space within which to do. So that's the one approach that understands it literally. Chabad philosophy in particular rejects this idea and says that, and we'll see soon why, from a non-Chabad source, actually from a source that predates Hasidism, and so we'll understand that in a moment. What's the Chabad perspective? What's the perspective we're going to be focusing on tonight? Is a non-literal contraction. What does that mean? A non-literal contraction. It means that what God basically did was He concealed His light. So there's an infinite light. The infinite light was in its natural state of being revealed. And what God did was He simply concealed it. He hid it. He hid it. So there's no empty space in the sense that it's devoid of that energy. No, that energy is still there. The infinite light of God is still there. It's just that you can't see it. Right? And then He brings out, and that creates this environment through which His finite capacity can be manifested and can be revealed. Okay, so we're going to make sense of this momentarily. Just that's where we're going. So let's try and understand. Yeah. So we said it's not a literal contraction; it's not a non-literal one, right? Let's look at text 2a from the Shomer Emunim, Rabbi Yosef Irgis. He says like this: those who wish to understand the tzimtzum in a literal manner will be led to beliefs that contradict most of the fundamentals of our faith. First of all, we are explicitly taught, to whom do you compare God, and what likeness can you arrange for Him? If, however, you take the tzimtzum literally, you are indeed imposing an image on God, an encompassing circle, an empty space, and a straight channel within that space. So he says you can't. So he has this philosophical problem with this, with understanding this teaching of the Ari literally, right? Because if we're talking about circles and spaces and emptiness and places that God is not, well, then we're already ascribing some kind of corporeality to God and definition to God that we are that obviously is not okay. Another issue, he says, text 2b. Additionally, the Zohar states numerous times that there's no place where He is not, from the highest of levels to the lowest of levels, and in every direction. If you suggest that the tzimtzum is literal, you are insinuating that there's a place devoid of Him, for in this empty space, only a narrow channel descended. Right? So what we're saying is that the Zohar, which our primary source text of Kabbalah, right, says numerous times that there's no space that God isn't. There's nowhere that is devoid of God, right? But if you're going to take tzimtzum literally, that would imply that there is a space that was empty. Now, true, God projected back into that space, but inherently that space is now a space that's devoid of God. And that this godliness is now imposed, sort of superimposed back onto that empty space, a space where God is not. And so that doesn't. Let's see text 3 from the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad. He says, the tzimtzum does not mean that God's infinite light departed, God forbid. Right? In other words, he's saying we're not going to say that the tzimtzum described by the Ari is literal, for in truth, there is no place devoid of Him, right? Exactly the same reference from Rabbi Irgis. This principle is also expressed in the Midrash. Why did God choose to reveal Himself to Moses from within a thorn bush? To teach that there's no place devoid of God's presence, even a thorn bush. Instead, in this context, the meaning of tzimtzum is that Or Ein Sof went from a state of revelation to one of concealment without actually departing at all. Right? It's interesting. He uses this term, quotes the Midrash that says we're all familiar with God's first revelation to Moses, which is in a sneh, in a thorn bush. Right? That the thorn bush, Moses sees that there's a bush that's on fire, it's burning but not being consumed, and so he goes to see. That's the first communication, direct communication he has with God. Is this communication through a thorn bush? So the Midrash asks, why is it that God reveals Himself to Moses in a thorn bush, a lowly kind of a lifeless, prickly thing? And so there are a number of reasons, but one reason the Midrash gives is to show that there's nothing, even a lowly thorn bush is not absent, God's presence is not absent from it. He's there as well. His presence is there as well. In all of these things. I think that's part of one of the reasons that others learn that the tzimtzum is to be taken literally is because they're bothered by the idea that there could be unholiness, evil in the world. How could there be evil? How could there be lowliness in this world? If everything is, if God's everywhere, how is it possible for evil to exist? So because of that, they want us to suggest literally, but that's a really different topic, and we can still come to that, even understanding tzimtzum not literally, right? But the point is here, even a thorn bush, God is there, right? There's nowhere that He isn't, even this. So this lends credence to this idea that you can't understand this concept of tzimtzum literally. Okay. But the point is that God contracts His infinite light, right? And so conceals. So first you have this infinite light that's manifest, that's everywhere. God contracts it, right? Meaning He conceals it. And from that concealment, there's now the space to identify to reveal, to bring forth his finite capacity and ability. Okay, so the purpose of that concealment is for this revelation. So you have this idea, these two terms, the next two terms we have here, Giloi and Helam, right? Giloi is revelation, and Helam is concealment. So these are two modes through which God interacts, through Giloi revealing himself and Helam concealing himself. But what does this mean? How do we make sense of this? And how does this explain the transition from infinite to finite? Exactly. So as we said, God, being truly infinite, has the capacity for both being infinite and being finite, right? To suggest that God doesn't have the capacity for being finite would limit him to infinity. That would be putting a limit on God. That's not possible. So obviously, we have to recognize that God has that capacity for finiteness. The problem is, in the face of infinity, how does that emerge? How does that emerge? So one of the analogies that's given in Hasidic philosophy, this analogy we discussed in lesson 2 actually as well, sort of a similar concept, that suppose you had this great, brilliant scientist that was coming to lecture to grade schoolers, to elementary school kids. Suppose Newton is coming to share some of his Newtonian ideas and physics with young little students. To share the mathematics and the calculations and all of his theories would be overwhelming. Nobody would understand it. The crowd simply would not understand what he was saying, right? So what does he have to do? So what he has to do, brilliant mind like that, needs to basically sit with his ideas, and he needs to try and tune out all of the mathematics and all the calculations and all the methodologies and all the studies and all the experiments, tune it all out of his mind, right? All of those numbers, tune it all out, and find some kind of practical application of the theory that he can then share, or ramification of that theory, and share that with the students, and they'll be able to relate to it. At that point, when he shares this idea with the students, they will have Newtonian theories. They will have now grasped it, not the full width and breadth of it, not the full scope of it, not the full extent of it, but they will have a piece of it that they will have. Right? I don't know, maybe say the theory, his theory on gravity, you could say, they say that he started on that by watching an apple fall off the tree, right? So the idea that the apple falls off the tree and it's being pushed by gravity or pulled by gravity down to the ground, there's a force that's moving it downward to the ground. That's something that's perhaps relatable to anybody who's seen anything fall, right? But without the full depth and breadth of the understanding, right? But still, that's sort of a piece of that idea. So what happens? Let's go through this a second. You have this brilliant mind that has brilliant ideas, and now has to, in order to be able to communicate, looking to communicate just a sliver of those ideas with more simple-minded or less developed minds. The way he has to do that, like I said, is to sort of block out the way he thinks of these things in his own mind, the way he even communicates these things at lunch in the teacher's lounge with his fellow, scientists and professors, right? He's got to block all of that out and almost not necessarily come up with a new language, but find something very specific to be able to teach. And the way to do is to silence everything else. Now, this silencing of this idea that's sort of swimming around in his head, is the idea gone? Has he lost the idea? No, of course not. The idea is there in his mind. It's just now in a state of concealment. Instead of being, the way he might have prepared to teach his peers, let's say, and be sort of absorbed and lost in the full beauty of the idea. Here, it's a lot simpler. It's a lot calmer. His mind's a lot quieter. A lot less going on. The ideas are still there. They're just concealed. And because they're concealed, that allows for these details to start to emerge. These specific examples to emerge that he can then communicate. Okay, so it's the same idea. God is infinite, but God needs to sort of conceal his capacity for the infinite in order to reveal that sliver of infinity, which is actually his finite capacity. Okay, let's take a look at text 4a to see it in the words of Chassidus. Yeah, page 149. Consider the example. This is from the Rebbe Rashab, from Rabbi Shalom Dogber of Lubavitch. Consider the example of a teacher imparting information to students. The profound concept the teacher understands is incompatible with the student's mental abilities. True, the profound concept contains less significant elements that are compatible with the student's minds. Nevertheless, in the teacher's mind, these elements are filled with the profundity of the overall concept, and they therefore remain too deep to deliver to the students. The main obstacle here is that there's no distinction in the teacher's mind between the core of the concept and its less significant elements. Consequently, if the teacher proceeds to transmit this knowledge to the students, the teacher will deliver the full profundity along with the less significant components. The students will understand none of it. The solution is for the teacher to conceal the entire concept, mentally pushing the whole idea aside to approach it anew. The teacher can now distinguish between the idea's core and the more superficial elements. The teacher can then deliver the transmittable details without flooding these elements with the overwhelming complexity of the core concept. Right? So this idea that we can find those little components, right? Those little aspects that are relatable, it has to be preceded by this concealment of the fullness of that idea. There's a story about this, the author of this text, the Rebbe Rashab. He says elsewhere in some of his discourses and writings, he says that a teacher teaching a student, I think the number was 4. He says that that the teacher has to go through 4 tzimtzums, as it were, 4 contractions in order to transmit the ideas as they exist within his mind. In order to be able to successfully transmit them to the student, he has to go through 4 contractions. He once hired one of his students to be a teacher of Chabad philosophy in one of his schools. And this chassid says, his father says to him, the Rebbe says that when a teacher teaches students, the idea has to be contracted 4 times. It goes through 4 stages of contraction before you can. And I can't do that. I don't even know what that really means, right? I can't do that. So they said that wasn't talking about you. We're talking about teacher-student. You're talking about a teacher-student where you're talking about the gulf between them, the gap between them is so vast, almost obviously not unbridgeable, but almost on that verge of unbridgeable. People, existing in totally different worlds. When they exist in these totally different worlds, in order to bridge that, to go from the finite, from the infinite to the finite, you need to go through these contractions. Okay, and if you want to follow along in figure 5.1 on page 151, the parable and the analog breaks down sort of a breakdown of this idea and how it relates to tzimtzum. So the point is that let's finish now text 4b. Okay, let's finish from the Rebbe Rashab. He says like this, 152. The above parable allows us to appreciate the concept of tzimtzum. Before the tzimtzum, God's ability to express finite divinity was part and parcel of his prevailing infinity, because the entire theme of Or Ein Sof before the tzimtzum is to reflect the infinite capacity of God's essence and to resemble it. The tzimtzum enabled the separation of these 2 powers of expression. Right, so the tzimtzum brings to the fore this capacity for being finite as it's sort of independent, as it were, as its own standalone idea, not just as a part of his infinite capacity. Okay. So what happens? God. We can go back to the text that we started with, right, from the Eitz Chaim, about the circle of infinity. God creates this concealment, right? He contracts that infinite light, and so there's a concealment that takes place. As a result, that allows for the emergence of this straight line, meaning God's finite capacity, right? This idea that he can reveal finite power. And this power, this finite line, as it were, right? Something with a beginning and end, a definition. That is now projected into that space so that what can emerge are things that are definable. Suddenly, God's 10 divine attributes can start to emerge. The idea of lights and vessels, all this starts to take shape as a result of God projecting his finite power, creative power, into that space. Right? So we see how this takes place. You need to be able to hide, as it were, your infinity in order to reveal that finite, in order to introduce definition and limitation. At the same time, though, we have to remember that his infinite capacity didn't go anywhere. It's still present. It's still here. It's the canvas on which this is all painted. It's just that it was just separated in the sense that it's not discernible. We don't see it. We don't sense it, and so therefore we can appreciate that finite capacity, the finite power. Okay, so this is how we get this. This is the idea of tzimtzum. The first tzimtzum. There are many tzimtzums. It talks a lot about talked before about the 4 tzimtzums you need just for a teacher to teach a student, right? So but this is the general idea of the tzimtzum rishon, that first contraction within the Or Ein Sof itself. Before we get into all of this Seder Shas, before we start getting into what we've been talking about, this whole process of creation. But then there's something else. We now know how you get from infinite to finite. But the question still remains, how do you get from nothing to something? How do you get from godliness to otherness? How does that happen? So here we're introduced to the second tzimtzum. Okay, let's take a look here at text 5, page 153. Okay, text 5 from the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe. He says like this, in his Eitz Chaim, right, which is the text we quoted, we started tonight with text 1, right? So in Eitz Chaim, Rabbi Chaim Vital discusses a dividing curtain between Atzilus and Beria. This curtain, right, again, so that's, if you're looking at the chart right behind me, you'll see on your chart the parsa, right, between the blue area and then the 10 attributes, that parsa. This is a dividing curtain between Atzilus and Beria. This curtain is the concealing garment that enables the creation of entities with a sense of independence. It is comparable to a physical screen that conceals light. Although some light succeeds in piercing the barrier, that light is merely a secondary product of the original light. Other sources explain further that this parsa, curtain, is akin to a parable's words, which entirely conceal the profound message of an analog. For example, consider the parable cited by King Solomon. He vested supernal secrets in mundane ideas that hide the mystical truths. One who reads these parables gains a mere glimmer that is incomparable to the core supernal secrets. Okay, so before we do that, we've arrived at our, I think, fifth and final key term of the night. Yes? Yeah? No, we have one more still to come. Our fifth key term of the night, which is parsa. Parsa, which means curtain, right? A dividing curtain. What does this mean? So again, we talked before about tzimtzum harisha in the first contraction, and what we say that was a concealment. God hides himself and then reveals something that emerges out of that concealment. Parsa is something else. Parsa is, imagine what's a curtain? You take a light, so you can have a light, and if you put a curtain up in front of the light will still shine through the curtain, right? Depending on how thick the curtain is, right? Its opacity. But the light that's coming out on the other side is already not the same quality light as what was shining onto the curtain. The curtain impacts the light and thickens it, right? It makes it more dense, thicker. It might even change its color, right? Change its temperature, possibly, I don't know. But the point is that it changes what's emerging on the other side of the curtain. Yes, it's that original light beam that's shining, it shines through the curtain, but it's already been tainted or jaded by the curtain. The curtain has its fingerprints all over that light now, where before it was a pure light, now it's a light wrapped in a curtain, right? Impacted by the curtain. Here, before, when we talked about tzimtzum rishon, we gave the example of trying to remove the idea, and a very profound idea from your mind, to then find some relatable details within that idea, right? But both the idea that you're concealing and the ideas that emerge as a result of that concealment are all still the same original idea. It's all still the same original idea. It's kind of like if you have light shining, hitting the door, and you open the door, crack, the light will come through. So before when the door was open wide, there was a lot of light coming in. Now I have just a sliver of light coming in. But what's coming in? That pure, unadulterated light, right, coming through a crack. But here we're saying it's not coming through a crack, it's coming through a curtain. What's the difference? The curtain is like a parable. What's the function of a parable? I have there's a way, in the analogy before, we're trying to teach the students an actual, let's say, we're talking about Newton, to use an actual Newtonian idea, to give them that in a simplified sort of form, right? Okay. Here, when we say parable, what are we saying? A parable is something else. A parable is when you dress something up in something totally different, right? And he gives the example here of King Solomon's. He said, like, King Solomon was the wisest of all men because he was able to find 3,000 parables for any idea, to convey any idea. But take, for example, one of his famous works, the Song of Songs, right? King Solomon's Song of Songs. That if you were just to open the Song of Songs, you think it's a beautiful work, a beautiful romantic novel. God forbid, right? It's of romantic poetry. That's what it seemed like to you. But in reality, what is it? It's the story of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. It's couched in the two lovers and even the details, right? The way they describe each other. All of those details are significant. They're all parables for other ideas, for deeper truths that convey, that express and explain the nature of our relationship with God and the many facets of the relationship and the way that relationship works. Right? But if you just read the words and just read them literally, you just read about two young people that are madly in love, right? you can read the book and not even know that it's talking about God or the Jewish people. Right? It's possible. That's what happens with a parable. That's the power of a parable, why they're so effective in a way, and why they also serve a very important purpose in teaching, because they can communicate big ideas to people that can't necessarily have them, and then you can spend the rest of your life unpacking ideas from these parables, which is fascinating. But the point is, it's possible to have the parable and not know the analog, not know what the parable is for, what it's trying to teach you. Right? I just have the parable. I just have this story. I don't even know what the analog is. I don't know what the message behind it is supposed to be. That's possible, right? Why? Because, so here you see that you've taken an idea, let's say the relationship between God and the Jewish people, you've dressed it up in a parable, you've taken that, put that through a curtain, now it looks like man and wife, and it suddenly looks like something entirely different. It's exactly the same thing, right? You should be able to go from one back to the other, but it's taken on a different shape and form. This is the idea of Parsa, how we go from the world of Atzilus, which is all within godliness. There's no otherness. And then from there, that light from Atzilus, as it goes down into Bria, into the worlds of Biyah, it goes through a Parsa, it goes through a curtain. And now that light now has a certain thickness to it that's added to it, that is already the beginning of otherness, that then continues to devolve until we get from Bria, where there's already a feeling of otherness, although fully conscious of God, a full awareness of God, but still there's an otherness there, till it comes all the way down to our world, the lowest of these worlds, Asiya, and within Asiya, the Asiya Gashmis, the physical world of Asiya, where all we see is otherness. We don't see God at all, right? So that's how that process goes. At the same time, though, even in a parable, when a wise person teaches by way of parable, his ideas are still embedded in the parable. They're there. You might not have the capacity to extract it, maybe, but they're there. It's not missing from there. They're not absent. So even when the divine light goes from Atzilus and transitions into Biyah, and it comes through a parsa, it's still the same light. It's still the same light. That divine energy, godliness, is still there. Okay, so this is basically the idea of tzimtzum and parsa, which is another form of tzimtzum. And we have an understanding of it. We understand sort of its placement within the world of Kabbalah and what the purpose it serves, what it's here to explain, how we're supposed to understand it and how we should not understand it, and so on. That's tzimtzum. But now, how is this relevant to us, right? As we've been doing in every class, we're talking in the two parallel universes, how these things are with God and within the order of creation, and how do they play out within ourselves, since we're all in the image of God. So let's start with a text 6a from the previous year. He says like this. Yeah, page 156. Those who are self-obsessed and narcissistic become engrossed in their desires and wishes and completely forget about God. Similarly, their self-obsession precludes loving others. Their self-love generates divisiveness because it doesn't allow them to tolerate others. They think that whatever someone else says or does is directed against them. There's an incident that illustrates this point. A fellow who happened to be a tremendous scholar and well-versed in Torah once had a private audience, a yechidus, with my great-grandfather, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Lubavitch, right? He was the one we quoted just before, right, in text 5. Rebbe, he complained, the others are stepping all over me in the study hall. They do not appreciate what I have to say. They do not behave properly towards me, and they do almost the exact opposite of my opinion. The Holy Rebbe replied, your ego expands throughout the entire study hall. Wherever anyone steps, it's bound to be on you, right? So this is somebody who comes in. He's a scholar. He's a rabbi. He's learned, but he was a narcissist and had a big ego. And so when he comes, wasn't aware of it. He comes to him and says that everybody's making fun of me. Everybody's picking on me. So he says, yeah, when you put yourself everywhere, the words he uses, he didn't say pick on me. He says in Yiddish, they're stepping on me. They're trampling on me. Right? They're stepping on me. He says, well, if you occupy all the space, there's nowhere else for them to step. Wherever they're going to step, it's inevitably going to be on you. If everything is always about you, then it'll always be about you. They can't ever avoid it. That's your own ego, just completely unchecked and out of control. So we all have egos, right? We all start with an ego. And that ego, certainly when you're a child, you're born, everything's about you, the world revolves around you, everything's on demand, whatever it is that you need and want, so on. Eventually you start to learn how to keep that in check, hopefully, right? And make other space. But where does this come from? It comes from the very beginning of everything. In the beginning, there was only God and he filled all space. And filling all space meant there was no space for anything else, which means had there been somebody else, potentially they would be stepping all over God. right? He's filling all the space. But what does God do? God contracts himself. God says, you know what? I don't want to fill all spaces. I don't want to be everywhere, which would then preclude the capacity to have somebody else. I want somebody else. I want to make space for somebody else, right? That's what I'd like to do. And so God has this tzimtzum, this contraction, where he limits himself in order to make space for others. Let's take a look first at text 6b from the Rebbe. He says like this. You'll notice that the above story mentions that the individual felt like people were stepping all over him in the study hall. This is a highly instructive detail because a hall designed for Torah study is considered a miniature holy temple. Divinity is more acutely present and perceptible in a place filled with Torah study, similar to the presence of divinity within the holy temple. Despite that, this individual succeeded in maintaining a bloated ego even in this holy place. This detail of the story was included to underscore that knowledge alone without working on self-refinement is woefully insufficient. So much so that one's ego will infiltrate even a miniature sanctuary. This proves the indispensability of avodah. That's our final key term of the night, the internal work of character refinement, right? This is a very important term. If you read our weekly emails, that in the Hayom Yom section, that word avodah pops up many weeks, pops up very often. The word avodah, divine service, here, the way they translate it here is nice. The internal work of character refinement, right? So what does that mean? That we all have to work on ourselves. If we don't work on our character, then our egos can just go completely unchecked and just expand everywhere. And then you're fighting with everybody because everybody's offending you because everything's always about you. Everybody's thinking, Jackie Mason, remember, says, had this bit about how he was so self-absorbed and narcissistic. He says, when I'd go to a football game and I'd see the football players in a huddle and I thought they were talking about me, right? Wherever you go, that's all that's going on. It's all about you. Avodah, this, and the Rebbe says this idea that the previous Rebbe tells the story and mentions that he was saying that they were stepping on him in the study hall, meant to say that even in you could be a very big scholar, you can sit in the study hall, you can be in the synagogue, and even in the synagogue, we're in the synagogue, the whole layout of a synagogue, the whole structure of a synagogue, the function of a synagogue is to come in and be aware of God's presence. But even you can walk into such a place, wanting to pray, coming to pray, and still all you feel and all you sense is yourself, and express and expand yourself throughout the whole space, fill the whole space with your own self. Right? So we need to be able to work on ourselves to refine ourselves to limit that ego. And we take this cue from God. Okay, and here we're going to read text 7. It's one of my favorite chapters in Tanya. It's actually here they write chapter 48, but it's actually chapter 49 in Tanya, because you know, personally, I guess, right? You grow up, you're studying in a Chabad yeshiva, you're studying Chabad philosophy, and you're studying about the tzimtzum, and certainly occupies a lot of time. Tzimtzum is contraction, it's a technical, and then I remember one day discovering in a Chassidic text this point from Tanya, from chapter 49 in Tanya, and it struck me suddenly how the tzimtzum went from being this esoteric, mystical idea and very technical to becoming something very romantic. I mean, that's the way at least I understood it. You're free to feel differently, but it was this text basically that sort of gave me a whole different appreciation for the tzimtzum. It says like this, from the Alter Rebbe, yep. He says, text 7, reciprocation is a natural response. God set aside, figuratively speaking, his great infinite light and concealed it. He did this due to his love for us, to raise us up to him, for love induces one to restrict oneself for another. When we reflect on this deeply, our souls will spontaneously be ignited to reciprocate. We will feel motivated to forsake everything in order to cleave to him. So here, there's a couple of moving parts here. The Alter Rebbe here in chapter 49, Tanya, it's in a series of chapters where the Alter Rebbe is talking about developing love for God. And he gives different meditations and ideas to help us stimulate and nurture a love for God. And the one he introduces here in chapter 49 is this idea well, he talks of a few places about reciprocal love. It's the idea of reciprocating a love for God based on God's making space for us. What is he talking about? He's talking about tzimtzum. He says, you think about this idea of tzimtzum. What is tzimtzum? Tzimtzum is God making space for us and holding a space for us, right? Limiting himself so we can be. In other words, God, who's the ultimate existence, the only true existence, that is the true existence to the exclusion of any other existence, and that would be God, maybe as close you can come to defining God. We'll find out next week, maybe. You know, the closest you can maybe come to is the ultimate existence, right? But that ultimate existence negates any possible other existence. And God, it's not just that he moved over on a chair to make space for us. It's a very significant move to go from being the only existence to making space for otherness. That's a very profound limit that God puts on himself to make space for us, which tells you how important we are to him and how precious we are to him, how important this world and this whole project is to him. So when we think about that, we can always think, what have you done for me, and what has God? But you think about the fact that I exist means that God made space for me. He had to make space for me to exist. So everything else is already gravy. Everything else is already a cherry on the top, right? The fact that I exist already is the greatest sacrifice, let's call it, that God could make, right? Which is to remove himself from that space, obviously not literally, figuratively, right? So, but to make space for me, to allow that space for me. So this tzimtzum plays a role in our relationship with God. Hopefully, when we think about how important we are to God, that God can make space, limit himself for us to take up some space, right? We should reciprocate in kind towards God and make space for God in our own lives, right? It's like, what has God done for me? Well, the fact that I exist, he's done everything already, right? And am I making space for God in my life? Or am I too important? The things I have to do too important that I don't have time for God, right? So that's something to think about. But also in our interpersonal relationships with others. The idea of tzimtzum is very important. This idea of making space for somebody else, allowing space for somebody else, not to have to suck up all the air in the room, right? To actually want to hear what is somebody else's opinion about something, right? It's like the guy who's going on a date, and he's meeting with this woman, and they're sitting, and he's talking about himself and how he does this, he does that, he's a scholar, and he's accomplished this, and he has this degree, and that, is on and on and on. He's going on for 45 minutes. He's talking about himself, hasn't stopped talking about himself. And the girl's sitting there getting restless. Finally, he had enough self-awareness to realize that maybe he should stop talking. So he stops and he says to the girl, well, now why don't you tell me what you think about me? Right? It all had to be it's all about me. We have to make space, right, for somebody else. Okay, so that's the first very practical, and I would say even romantic sort of idea of tzimtzum and how it relates to us. But then there's another point, and we're going to finish tonight with a couple of texts from very appropriate source, the second Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber of Lubavitch, who was born today. Today was Wednesday, right? He was born on this day, the 9th of Kislev in 1773, and he passed away on this very day as well, the 9th of Kislev, earlier today in 1827. So today was his birthday and anniversary of his passing, and tonight / tomorrow, the 10th of Kislev, was the day he was released from Tsarist prison, a year before he passed away, which is a whole other story. So it's a day of his liberation. It's a day of celebration. So we have these 2 days, these 48 hours are really his days of the year. So it'd be appropriate to read texts from his teachings. We're going to read another implication of this idea of the tzimtzum. Okay, let's just jump. Let's just jump right into text 8a, right, from Rabbi Dov Ber, the birthday boy, and the his yard site and his redemption, all now. So very appropriate, and it's a great merit for him, but it's an even greater merit for us to be studying his teachings on this day. So he says like this: there was evening and there was morning one day, right? We all know that from Genesis, right? This verse informs us that there is no day without a night that precedes it. Why must it be so? Why does a day not exclusively consist of daylight hours, or perhaps just the night hours? Why must it include both evening and morning? And why must night precede the day? Right, so we know, like I just said before, it's already dark outside. Today was the 9th, but it's already the 10th, or it's already tomorrow, right? It's not midnight yet, but in the Jewish calendar, right, when the Shabbat starts, Friday night, at sundown. The day starts at night. So he's asking, what the verse says, it was evening, it was morning, one day, which means that a day consists of evening and morning. Both together form a day. Why can't it just be all day? Why can't it just be all night? And why does it have to be evening and then morning? Why does God set it up this way? So he says, the root of the matter is that at the source of creation, there was evening before morning. That is, darkness preceded light. For the tzimtzum preceded the sharing of God's kindness. This darkness-light combination extends to all the worlds, including our world, where night precedes day. So we see how tzimtzum plays out. Sorry? What was that?
Shabbat starts at night.
It starts at night, exactly. But we see how it plays out, even down to the way night and day work in this world. So it's almost like he's reading It's almost like you can read the idea of tzimtzum, this Lurianic idea, you can read it into the opening of Genesis, right? There's evening, there's morning, there's evening, there's concealment, that's tzimtzum, and then there's light, that's the shining of God's light into. And so since that's the way through which God brings all of existence, the possibility for existence before, and then ultimately what follows is existence and creation. So that's why creation mirrors this method and this process. And also the same thing happens. There's evening, concealment, darkness, and then comes light. And the same is true even within our own lives. So this is true how it plays out in reality. Evening and then morning, night and then day, darkness and then light, and the two together, right? Because you can't have existence without a tzimtzum. Just like you can't have without the revelation of the finite energy. You need both to bring about existence and creation. And the same, and that plays out even as creation unfolds, right? But the same is true even within our own lives. Within our own lives, we also live with a tzimtzum kind of a process. Let's see how. Let's see it in his own words, Rabbi Dovber, the Mittler Rebbe's words in 8b. We observe the same pattern reflected in the affairs of the world, whereby individuals do not achieve growth in wealth, leadership, building a family, study, or any other accomplishment without first experiencing humiliation, pain, loss, and the like. For example, individuals engaged in study will not arrive at a complete understanding of the subject without much toil and stress, feeling distant from understanding and tempted to despair for mastering the subject. Indeed, the Talmud states, one does not understand statements of Torah without first being mistaken. We observe the same in earning a livelihood, whereby we succeed only after putting forth great effort and enduring much pain, even feeling despair. Only thereafter do we find profit and great blessing. This is the way that God's blessings flow in the upper worlds and travel down to the lowest realm. There's no light without the darkness that precedes it. As it is stated, according to the pain is the reward. Right? So in other words, it's the way life works, right? Is there's challenges and obstacles and darkness, and we persevere through them, and that's how we come to the great light. That's how the big payoff, the success, always comes after the hard work, right? Or like the final word here is according to the pain is the reward, right? It's commensurate with the pain that goes in. But what does this mean? So we can understand that that's a fact of life. We can observe this phenomenon, but what does that mean practically, and how should that be encouraging? Well, first of all, if you're struggling and you feel you're on the verge of despair, don't despair. The light is coming, right? This is the darkness that's leading there is a light at the end of that dark tunnel, right? So number one, don't despair. The success is coming. Number two, right? If the darker sometimes it feels or the more challenging it becomes, is telling you that success is on its way. But in addition, when we overcome, that light is so much sweeter. That light is so much greater, so much more profound. The success that we have after real adversity and challenge is a much sweeter success than success it's not right. It's like this concept that we prefer to have something that we earned and toiled and worked hard for. We appreciate that a lot more than something that we just got unearned, undeserved, that just came to us. We value that and appreciate that a lot less. We take a lot less pride in something that we didn't work hard to achieve, to attain, right? It's called the bread of shame in Kabbalistic terminology as well, right? And so we'll look at text 9, our last text for tonight from the previous Rebbe. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, we quoted him earlier tonight. He he emerges as the leader of the Chabad movement and really of Russian Jewry, and really to an extent eventually to world Jewry in 1920, right? So this is right at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, and this is where he emerges now as this leader. Communism is now closing in and criminalizing any Jewish observance, trying to shut it all down. And he stands as this light in that darkness, standing up to the communists. He endured intimidation and threats and abuse and all kinds of stuff that he had to deal with. He had a very stressful and terrifying, you would say, life that he lived. Eventually comes to a head in 1927. He's arrested. He's actually originally sentenced to death because, what else, but because of international pressure, that's commuted. Yeah, it's 12 years of exile. And eventually he gets out. The Soviets eventually expel him from the Soviet Union. They kicked him out. They couldn't do anything. He was already this big leader. They expelled him from the Soviet Union. And he's out. The end of 27.
He came to the US.
And 1940, he comes to the US. First, he was in Latvia, Poland, and Latvia. Then, during World War II, he managed to escape and get to the United States.
Okay.
But the point is that, and he describes he'd been arrested many times. and been abused, tortured. And he said, take a look at this text 9. He says, this is after those years of suffering, after he was already out of there. He says, if someone would offer to sell me a single moment of additional suffering for $1 billion, I would not buy. If someone would offer to purchase a single moment of my past suffering for $1 billion, I would not sell. Right? So nobody wants suffering. We don't want to suffer. And to sell me suffering, even for $1 billion, that moment, the suffering that he endured, I'm not buying it. It's not worth it, right? On the other hand, the suffering that I have endured, all those things that I went through, those are priceless. That's priceless. And that's something that leads to this the greatness that emerges afterwards. So the point is, we have to recognize this. We're going to wrap it up, and then we'll open up for questions and comments. The tzimtzum, we learned tonight about the tzimtzum and the parsa, right? Two forms of tzimtzum, a contraction and concealment of the infinite light that allows the finite light to emerge. We learned about the parsa, which is a coarsening and a covering, in a sense, of the light that then leads to otherness, that leads to existence. And we learned about how these ideas play out in our own lives as well. The idea that just as God puts himself aside, limits his own omnipresence for us, to allow space for us, we're fake omnipresent. We're omnipresent maybe in our own minds, right? Make space for somebody else. Make space for God, make space for others. And also the idea that the tzimtzum is the darkness that precedes the light, that in order for something truly magical to happen, there needs to be that sort of concealment to begin with. That plays out both in the way we look at the calendar, right? Night and then day, darkness and then light, but also that it's the challenges, our challenges in life, and the dark periods of our life that lead to the greatest triumphs and to the greatest light. And so therefore we should never despair. We should never, and also recognize, of course, sort of an unspoken idea. I actually we mentioned it earlier in passing, but that all of these ideas of the tzimtzum are not to be taken literally, right? What's the big takeaway from that is that we're always dialed in. We're always connected with the infinite God, the infinite, anything is always possible. God's infinite light is always present with us. It's always there. We're operating in concealment, but it's there, and therefore we always should be able to access it and channel it as well. So even in those darkest moments, we have that profound, deep connection with God in his infinity. So not only do we not despair, but we know that we have the potential for anything and everything, and we will achieve great things and bring great light into the world. And with that, I thank you all for joining. We're going to open it up now for some Q&A.